Our scripture reading this morning is a familiar story. It comes from Luke 10 in the 30th verse, and it just reads, Jesus replied, "A man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he encountered thieves who stripped him naked, beat him up, and left him for death. Now it just so happened that a priest was going down the same road when he saw the injured man. He crossed over to the other side of the road and went on his way. Likewise, a Levite came by, saw the injured man, and crossed over to the other side of the road and went on his way. A Samaritan who was on his journey came to where the man was, but when he saw him, he was moved with compassion. The Samaritan went to him and bandaged his wounds, tending with them with oil and wine. Then he placed the wounded man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took 2 full days' worth of wages and gave them to the innkeeper. He said, 'Take care of him, and when I return, I'll pay you back for any additional cost.' What do you think? Which one of these 3 was a neighbor to the man who encountered the thieves?" The legal expert said, "The one who demonstrated mercy toward him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." And it's a familiar story. We probably all know it. But we also know another story of our present day. And so, in honor of this text, I wanted to read it to you perhaps a different way. And this is what I call the Good Samaritan 2020 edition. After months of quarantine, missed birthday parties, graduation parties, do-it-yourself haircuts, and 2 weeks of using your kid's college-ruled notebook paper as toilet paper, a man donned his mask and went down from Canton to Columbus. He really should not have been doing this, considering the COVID-19 advisory for Franklin County from the Ohio Public Health Advisory System. But it was his first trip out in these many weeks, and his singular thought had been on obtaining a cream puff from Schmidt's Restaurant and Banquet House in German Village. And weighing the risks of COVID-19 against the purchase and consumption of the cream puff, well, the cream puff won out. So the man goes down from Canton to Columbus when he fell into the hands of looters taking advantage of a peaceful protest in our state's capital. Now, it just so happened a pastor was walking down the same road when he saw the injured man, when he jaywalked across the street to the other side, as he did not wish to be associated with any form of protest, lest it affect the giving in his church. And after all, the man had a mask on, and everybody knows Christians don't need masks because God is on their side. He must have had it coming, the pastor thought. Plus, he was a very busy man, what with figuring out how to reopen worship again. Likewise, a member of the same church, walking by, set to have a meeting with the aforementioned pastor about how to get people to come to church in the middle of a pandemic, also passed to the other side and continued to the meeting. After all, giving was down, and that man should not have been near those protests like that. Jesus would never be associated with such a thing. One of the protesters, on a lifelong pilgrimage for equity in their community, saw the man and was moved with compassion. The protester went to him, bandaged his wounds with the first aid kit she always carries to protests. After all, this was not her first rodeo. Then she placed the wounded man in her Honda Accord and took him to a nearby hospital and tended to the man while they waited in the line at the emergency room. 3.5 hours later, they were handed a clipboard with enough paper that surely cost an acre of the Amazon rainforest and were asked to complete which parts they could. Once the man was admitted and safe within the walls and care of the hospital, the protester returned home, only to be moved by the words of Luke 10:35, and she returned to the hospital the next day with her 2 days of minimum wages she earned at her job at a grocery store in the suburbs, as her downtown neighborhood had no grocery stores for the nearly 10,000 residents that lived there. Did I mention she was also from Canton? So she returned to the hospital with $99.42 that she had earned over the course of 2 days, and handed it to the payment representative at the hospital, and like the scriptures, said to the representative, "Take care of him, and when I return, I'll pay you back for any additional costs." With a puzzled and amazed look, the hospital payment representative looked at the woman and was shocked and moved with such emotion because she was aware that the man was on a high-deductible 60/40 plan, and after orthopedic surgeries and minus the $99.42 received, told the woman what an act of charity it would be to donate the remaining $17,439.79. After remembering something her pastor said about the dangers of taking biblical passages literally, she reconsidered her offer, now more aware of the expense involved, and decided after being released from the hospital, bankruptcy might not be such a bad thing for the man, and it would be better if she and the man went out for cream puffs instead. Friends, there's a little bit of truth and a lot of joking in there, but our issue today is on poverty and health care. And while Christians may not agree about the answers when it comes to how we deal with this as a country, I think and know for a very fact that Christians do care about the questions raised here. The truth is, health care has always been a focus of Christianity. Jesus healed many, many people. And following the example of Jesus, for whom healing the sick was something he did all the time, early Christians made a practice of caring for folks who needed help. In a book written by a professor at Johns Hopkins University called Medicine and Healthcare in Early Christianity, Gary Fernigan talks about how philanthropy in the days of the early first Christian centuries isn't how we would see it today. The form of private charity for personal concern or those in need, such as orphans and widows and sick, was just not a thing. Especially with their worship of the Greek gods in that day, the Greek and Roman gods showed little pity on people and instead showed greater reward for the powerful and those people that could have more money and offer sacrifices. See, in the early first century Roman world, human worth was not intrinsic, but something that had to be earned by practicing some degree of sacrifices, or it was just something that was expected of educated people. See, but in the early days of Christianity, both Jews and Christians, and there wasn't a sort of differentiating difference at that time, Jews and Christians believed that human worth was predicated on the fact that each person was created in the image and likeness of God. This was a sacred fact for Christians. And as we talked about last week, and that I bring up here often, is that Matthew 25. And then when Jesus says, whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me, was something that the early Christians took very, very seriously. Although that physicians were likely to have endeavored to do no harm in the early days, Christian physicians in those days were certainly more likely to help the poor than their pagan counterparts, and and it's just something that they did as a result of their Christian faith. Because Christians in that day, for that matter, were guided by the compassion and the kind of love that Jesus Christ shows in our Bible. Such love is rooted in the self-giving, incarnational, redemptive love of God as made manifest in Jesus Christ himself. So we read the parable of the Good Samaritan, we see it becomes the example or the model of Christian love, of what Jesus puts before his believers when asked the question of who is my neighbor. Jesus puts forward the parable of the Good Samaritan to be the model of love and service for all of us. It guides us to take the words of Jesus in Matthew 25 very seriously, even when it comes to the conditions of poverty and health care in our community. Because although health care may not look the same now as it did in first century in the ancient Near East, one of the ways we organize training events in the Army were by these three words: task, conditions, standard. And all that meant was to say that anything that we did had to be done. You have your task, you have the conditions, the thing you can't affect, everything that affects how you do your task, and then we have a certain standard that we are set to meet in all of the tasks that we set out to do. Everything from filing your rifle to marching 12 miles to assembling and disassembling your weapon, the task, conditions, we have the standard to which all of that is to be done. And looking at Matthew 25 in the parable of the Good Samaritan, we see our task and our standard. But something else we often saw in the United States Army was that the conditions change. And that though in 2020, when we're dealing with the raising costs of prescription medications and healthcare costs during the 20th century, including dramatic cost increases for emergency health insurance care. We continue to see a rise in the number of uninsured Americans. We realize that the conditions change, but our task and our standard do not. Where does that leave us? As of late 2019, most people would say that they're satisfied. 61% of people would say that they're satisfied with their health care costs. Most folks. Almost 80% are satisfied with the quality of health care that they receive. And even more folks are satisfied with the amount of coverage that they receive. That still leaves 1 in 5. And the parable of the Good Samaritan and Jesus' words to us in Matthew 25 are any guiding principles. If we are to take those passages seriously, we must also care about the 1 in 5. The Bible teaches us that our bodies are a temple, a gift from God. As a result, taking care of our bodies, and the parable of the Good Samaritan shows us other people's bodies. Caring for the most vulnerable parts of our society are not an option for us. I've been doing these short conversations that partner with each of these topics, and today, poverty and healthcare. Now, she asked not to be on camera, but Sister Carolyn Capuano was the one that I had interviewed this week. And she's a sister over at Mercy Hospital. And I was a bit concerned, knowing that Mercy Hospital does a great deal of charity work in Canton and always has, that the Cleveland Clinic, that the possibility was going to come that they were going to come and purchase Mercy Hospital. So I called to talk to her about whether or not this was going to stay the same. And she brought up a couple things to me, just saying that last year that Mercy Hospital provided $8 million in charity, and that they go ahead and they budgeted that same amount for next year. And that despite what happens with the Cleveland Clinic, they're going to keep their Catholic identity and continue to do that level of charity. She said that one of their main functions is the care for persons, accept anyone who comes. No numbers, cared for large groups of undocumented Spanish-speaking migrants here in Canton, Ohio. How they have medically trained translators to help with that community and support the people that are most vulnerable here in Canton, Ohio. She says many folks have no insurance or in extreme poverty in our community, and that they do everything they can to be as generous with their charity policy as they can. With COVID-19, Mercy is even in its 20th week of providing meals to the southeast end of Canton, something they started 9 years ago at St. Paul's Square. And one of the things that she said to me that really struck me, and it's something that I see on the streets every week here as well, she says it takes a lot of energy to live life while you're in poverty. How much energy would it take for us folks who are not to care about those folks who are? Friends, I realize that Christians and people are on both sides of this issue of what to do with health care in our country moving forward into this election. But I think it's clear the tasks that we're given and the standard to which we are to achieve as Christians in our world and in our community, despite the conditions. Praise God, friends. Have a great and wonderful week.